welcome to this week's episode of the Marina Perry Podcast. I am your host, and it is an honor and a privilege to have you here with us. This week, my guest is Brianna Bowley, and she is a trauma coach for high-performing women. And this topic has got me juiced up, so I don't want to wait a second longer. But of course, we have to ask Brianna our two forever questions. So the first one, Brianna, is what is the animal that best represents your spirit, your energy, your way of being, and why? And by the way, welcome to the show, and thanks for being here. Forgot to say that.
Thank you so much for having me. And I love that question. My answer would be a wolf. I've always felt a real synergy to wolves. And I think it's because they're a pack animal. However, they're often misunderstood for being, the lone wolf. And I think that they have this beautiful way of, when you really look into the way that their packs are organized and the way that they run in their packs, they do it in a way where they're protecting the old, they're protecting the young. And I just think that really kind of represents me in the way that I like to live my life.
I love that. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
And the second question is, what is the superpower you would choose to have and why?
I think I would like to be able to fly, because there's just something about having a higher perspective, to be able to, see out over, a broad vantage point. I think that it kind of, for me, it grounds me. I'm someone who I love to stand out and look out over balconies and just see the world go by. So I think flying would be another level of that.
I love your answers. They really do speak to the fact that you're a coach, do you know, if you get the higher perspective, that's beautiful. So Brianna, as a trauma coach, which is, that's a specific field, it's a big title. How did you come to be a trauma coach? And why is this work important to you?
Yeah, I'm a big believer that we teach what we most need to learn. I've definitely had my fair share of trauma. And I think that, like with most people, I come from a lineage of different traumas. And so I'm a big believer in, we get to be the person who kind of heals the lineage, heals the ancestry. So part of it was my search to heal my own things, to heal my lineage. And I just fell in love with it. I mean, I love people. I love understanding how people think, why people do the things that they do. And to be quite honest, I sort of fell into it. As I said, I was on my own healing journey. I was doing a lot of performance-based work. So working with athletes, working with business owners and a lot of coaches, helping them to perform better with competitions or with their careers. And then I kind of took a step back and went, well, what's the key thing that I always kind of come back to in working with all of these individuals? And it was actually digging through their traumas and helping to hit that next level through healing trauma. And so that's where the transition kind of happened.
And for anyone listening, I think it's really important because language is so nuanced and unique to each of us, and yet it creates the map upon which we live. So that we're all having, as best we can, the same conversation. What does trauma mean to you?
Okay, so I love that you've asked this question, because I think people tend to think trauma is like, I guess the things we traditionally think of as trauma, something like abuse or, witnessing something violent or being in an accident or, something like that. For me, my definition of trauma is anything that has us disconnect from ourselves. And so that can be something as simple as, I always use this example because it's my own experience, something as simple as tripping up a gutter while people are watching and having someone giggle. Yes. Anything that has us disconnect from ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. And I spend a lot of my time trying to re-educate people around the concept of trauma. And I actually just did a coaching session this afternoon for someone, and someone who, much like me, had a really blessed, amazing upbringing. We did not experience any quote unquote trauma as the old textbooks would define it. And yet we're all creating codes and we're all learning from our role models. And in seemingly benign moments, like everyday, realities, when you regress someone, it can be in that moment, you simply made a decision and an equation, if you will, that something equals something, and you lock it in. And then you seek to be right about it, repeat it, and essentially you're re-traumatizing yourself with the same poor decision, or in that moment. And I feel that people are resistant to the term trauma because it's been so dramatized. And so would you say, in your example there, tripping over a gutter and giggling, I love it, because who hasn't done that, right? Why, in what way did that have you disconnect from yourself? In what way did that create, I can imagine, but for the listener, how has that created a ripple effect that then in some way has restricted you from having what you want in life?
So for me, to kind of give context, that day I was dressed up, I was feeling good about myself. I was strutting my way down Rundle Mall down in my hometown of Adelaide, and just feeling really centered, really grounded. And I had that experience of tripping up the gutter. And so what it brought up for me was that it's not safe to be seen. That when I draw attention to myself, that if something goes wrong, then I become the laughing stock. And so, that was essentially the belief that it instilled in me, that it's not safe to be seen. It's not safe to stand out.
And I love sharing that, like the map of that, if you will, with the listener, because you and I would both know everyone's got something like that, something that logically you go, that doesn't make sense. Brianna, don't be ridiculous. Tripping over a gutter doesn't mean you shouldn't be amazing in the world. Like, haha, of course, silly. But the truth is what's running your system, right, is that belief. And it's dug down so low. And so when you mentioned before that you now work with high performing women specifically, but you work with athletes and, business people that wanted to achieve higher levels of performance. And you said we dig down and it was always their trauma. Another way, if someone's listening is like, I don't associate with trauma. Another way would just be saying like a really deep limiting block, right? That would be another way potentially of them associating to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But there is a relationship. Well, I'm going to ask the question rather than assume it. Is there a relationship, Brianna, between your nervous system and trauma and the physiology of that experience, that is beyond just a belief, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we have these traumatic experiences, again, whether they're the traditional things that we think of as trauma or more of these kind of minor quote unquote experiences, what happens is that the nervous system has one of three responses, and these are our survival responses. So we either go into a freeze response, which is like a shutdown, a hopelessness, a sense of depression, a sense of sadness. And we can see this as, in a more extreme sense, literally freezing or fainting. Out in the wild, we see it as animals playing dead. Or we go into more of a sympathetic response, which is either a fight response or a flight response. And so again, if we go out into the wild, we see this as animals, when they're cornered, they either strike or they try to run. And so again, with humans, we either become defensive, we become aggressive if we're going into that fight response, or we go into wanting to flee. So for me, if we come back to that example of tripping up the gutter, all this sort of shame and embarrassment came up and I just wanted to run. I think we can all resonate with the experience of, I just want the world to open up and, swallow me up. That's that flight response. That's wanting to run. That's wanting to, disappear.
Yeah. And so then for the listener, the reason that's important, I would imagine, is because, and what will track forward in your life is that because that was the response you wanted, or it's sometimes the response that worked, if you did shrink back, if you didn't say anything and you quote unquote survived the reality, you'll seek to do that again and again, won't you?
Yes. Yeah.
And this
absolutely.
is where people will go, I don't, and just for anyone listening, sometimes it's way easier to see everyone else's patterns until you start, say, working with a coach. But if you're like, I don't think I do that, then look for someone else in your life. You're like, why do they always run away from the arguments? Or why do they always leave? Because they've got, as Brianna is saying, a coded physiological response. It's in their nervous system that happens because we're animals first, right? And so how would you suggest, or is it even important to know what our response is? Like, is it important to know? Is it important to understand our nervous system? Or is it just like, well, that's how it is, so whatever, just you have to be with it?
Yeah, I think it's insanely important. in my personal opinion, it's the most important thing to understand what your go-to response is in certain situations, because that will be the thing that has you, continue to play out these patterns. And if we always do what we've always done, we always get what we've always got. And so we can't go out and create new things, new experiences, new relationships, new levels of abundance and connection and whatever else we're striving for, unless we shift these patterns. And so, I think the key is, first of all, having awareness around them, starting to notice, well, what does happen in these situations when I'm feeling threatened, when I'm having these moments where I don't feel safe, what is my go-to response? And then from, having the awareness, then we can start to shift it, and we can start to rewire and repattern those habits so that we can start to, build more safety within the system, because safety is the building block for absolutely everything.
Yeah, true. That is true. And so if someone is listening going, okay, well, I get a sense that maybe I shut down because when my partner and I have conflict, or when things get tough at work, I just kind of shrink. I don't say anything. I can't think properly. My whole system goes into a freeze response, let's say. Or they might say that they do just disappear, and they might be able to sort of start to see how they're doing what they're doing. But then when you say we get to repattern and reprogram, so I suppose the challenge is, if you're in a fight or flight response or in a reaction, it's a triggered state, right? It's a biological response. So what are your tips for someone who's in the state, or is it not wise to reprogram it in the state? Like, how do we go about the rewiring process, let's say?
So it's a matter of, I guess, over time, just practicing, and I always kind of use the analogy that the first time it happens, so you may become aware that, your pattern is that you go into freeze response, let's say, and you might have an experience pop up, you go into freeze, and then 2 weeks later, you go, oh my God,
yes,
that time I had that argument, I went into freeze response. And in that moment, you get to celebrate that you caught it, that you caught the pattern, that you have a new level of awareness that you didn't have before. And then the next time you might get into an argument or have something occur, which brings on that freeze response. And this time it might take you 3 days, and then we get to celebrate. And the celebration piece is so important, because it's anchoring that it's safe to have that experience. Because I think what happens a lot within the self-development industry is that, we go, oh, I've done that thing again. Oh, I know better. Yes. And then we actually shame ourselves, which then pushes us back into that cycle of freeze.
Yes, I'm like so excited that we're having this discussion, because I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. And it's a great in so many areas of life, but particularly in the realm of growth and personal awareness, I feel like there is this weird desire or expectation that once you pop it, it's done, and yet if we took that and we said, well, I went to the gym once, how come I'm not, like a buff bodybuilder, I lifted weights that one time, we'd be like, it doesn't work like that. And the same if we made a recipe one time in the, in the kitchen, and it was a little bit dry, or it's a little bit flopped, it'd be the next time around that we'd get better at it. And yet I love what you're saying, and I agree with what you're saying. And even as someone who's been in the growth space, just like you, like many, many, many years, decades, sometimes you cannot catch it yet. Maybe a higher level of yourself will catch it in the moment, or you will witness it and see it in the moment, and yet you still you don't have capacity necessarily to stop it,
Absolutely.
And so I know for myself, repair, as quickly as possible, particularly if it's something that I've projected, say, onto my children, or it's a reaction. And, maybe in the past, I just wouldn't have thought anything of it. And then, like you say, I love that. You catch it 2 weeks later, and it's like, yes, look what I noticed. And then 3 days later, and maybe it's now you do it. And then 10 minutes later, you walk into the room and you say, hey, listen, I'm so sorry and then you explain and you repair. And it can get to that level. And I know even with my partner, just this week, we had, a little trigger, a moment where there was a little bit of projection, things didn't go the way we wanted. And in the time, I could see what was happening. I could see there was projection. I was like, okay, I can see he's projecting. I can see he's frustrated. And I also knew that his response in that moment was, he wanted time away, like space. He wanted space. And of course, I run this desire to fix things. But the growth for me was to go, okay, and then just turn and leave him and go in the other direction.
Beautiful.
So that we could then later have I would say like a conversation where we're centered and we can speak without being triggered. And there was still some learnings and some fuddles in that process too. I have to admit this week, I was like, babe, I feel like we're failing and we should be better at this than we are. But, and it's a process and it's evolving. But when I compare our now arguments or our now triggers to our 5 year ago triggers, we're like gold medalists now, So I love what you're saying is look at it over time, and it may always be imperfect. That's the human, reality. But in the growth space, look at the progress. Like 2 weeks to 2 days is brilliant. So I love that you said that. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that and making that known that it is a muscle that gets to be flexed.
Absolutely.
And so then I suppose the question is, the noticing is important, as you said, and the awareness is important, and the safety, I agree with you. So important. But then how, if my body wants to shut down or if my body wants to run away, even though I might notice it, how do I start creating change for it? If that makes sense, like bringing in a different action or behavior.
Yeah. So I always encourage my clients, first of all, we track it. So, I and this sounds really quite dull, but I love data. I'm a data collector. So
I love dull. I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah.
Perfect. I always encourage my clients, like, let's start actually tracking, okay, in situations where you have a conflict with a person, this is what the fight response looks like. This is what the freeze response looks like. These are the thoughts that come up. These are the sensations that I have in my body. This is how I then behave. And, these could be things like, I immediately want to go have a drink, or I immediately want to go eat a block of chocolate, or, I want to go watch Netflix and zone out. And so that adds that extra depth of awareness. And, we start to see, okay, the degree at which it's affecting our life and how it's affecting our life. And we can make the decision of whether it's those behavioral patterns are effective or not. And then from there, it's a matter of starting to kind of build a toolkit. And so recognizing that everyone's nervous system is completely different. So for what works for me might be completely different to what works for you and the next person, and so on. So I know that for me, when I'm in a fight mode, when I start to go into that fight, that defensiveness, certain breathwork techniques work incredibly well for me. Yeah. Or in the moments where that doesn't work, doing something like shaking or going for a run, or a primal scream, or doing some sort of an activity that shifts energy and moves all of that extra energy that's coming up as anger. Yep. That brings me back to my center. Yeah. And I think the more we get kind of honed in on how our nervous system responds and what works well for us, the less we have to kind of do these big, like once upon a time for me, when I would go into fight response, I would have to go for like a 5-kilometer run to shift that. Whereas now it's a matter of I can literally, most of the time, depending on how extreme the trigger is, I can sort of just go, and I can make the decision of, this isn't how I desire to feel.
Yeah. And I'm going to piggyback on that, because as I hear what you're saying, what I think would be a great segue now is, one of the key things is really just a conscious, constant awareness of your state. Right. And then the ability, like if you track your baseline and you're aware of your baseline, then you can become attuned to deviations from the baseline before they become potentially like catastrophic, let's say, and you're like way off track. And then equally, so, that's something I know. I'm very attuned kinesthetically to my body. And even today, it was a busy day, just as a benign example, but as an example. And I left one appointment and I had enough time to get to the next, but when it's next to next, and I could just feel my heart starting to race a little. And I was like, okay, I can feel that edge of anxiety. And I was like, what am I anxious about? And I'm like, it's just, there's a lot on. And I was like, yes, but there's time for it. Like I'm having a schizophrenic conversation with myself. Right. And then in my head, I'm like, there is time. Yes, there's a lot, but there's time. It's all going to fit, it's just, and then I just, in that moment, just took one deep breath in and just sighed it out, and it just washes away. It just needs acknowledgement sometimes, right? And then to be met with, safety. And okay, I see what you're concerned about, and it's okay.
Yeah.
And so then the question I suppose I have is, that's an awareness I've cultivated, but what say someone's baseline is already really high? Do you know what I mean? Or is so high all the time that they don't really know. Do you ever have clients that don't really yet know what a baseline of like calm is because they're constantly in a fight or flight state? Like they're just.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot, I find high performers are often very, in that fight state. They're in, there's subtleties, and I don't want to kind of give this like a black and white context where people will go, oh, I'm a high performer, high achiever, so that must mean that I'm operating from survival. But so recognizing that it's nuanced. But I do see a lot of people who are living in that fight state, and that's why they've gone out and created these incredible empires, because they're actually fighting to survive. I don't say that literally, but that's the energy behind it. So for them, it's actually about teaching them how to be in stillness. And so that comes down to, I call it, like building the body that can hold it. So we have this thing called a window of tolerance, and our window of tolerance is how much of a particular sensation we can experience before it becomes too much and before we start to go into that survival reaction. So when we're trying to build our window of tolerance so that we can handle more stimulus, more situations, and just kind of affirming here, when I say stimulus, I'm talking about both, a lot of stimulus and no stimulus. We're building our capacity to hold that. And so for someone who's very active, very in that really engaged fight or flight energy, it's just slowly teaching them to, and that might start with 30 seconds of just nothingness, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, and so on.
I think it's, I've shared it before, and I have no problems always sharing my shite, I guess, and the journey through it. But I was 100% adrenally run, high performing, get it done human. High performance would be an understatement for the earlier part of my career, just at the capacity at which I would work and the deliverables and what I would do. And any, often for entrepreneurs or high performing, anyone in any field, that's, you just do it because that's what you're committed to. And it's a beautiful thing, right? Mm-hmm. And sadly though, the world really does applaud it, which then fuels it a little bit. But I love what you're saying there, because, and what I wanted to speak into perhaps for the listener is, you don't feel like you're in a fight or flight response, right? That's the important thing to understand here, is when you're go 100 miles an hour, that feels normal to you. That's kind of what I'm saying about that higher baseline than a lower baseline, is like, you don't know that you're operating at a go level. And when you try to slow down, so for instance, if when I was much younger, went to say a yoga class, I was like, oh my God, this is horrible. I can't, like, what even is this? Because I was expected to A, not think, and B, stay still for a while. I mean, and since then, I have yoga teacher training certifications, and love a yin yoga class, but a younger versions of me, that would have been like, I just shoot me. I would rather do that. My system couldn't handle the stillness, the quietness. It just wanted to implode, because the go was how I knew how to live. So as you're saying, it really is like almost feel, even though it's coming out of a near-death experience, it feels like a death experience to come into that slower state. So you're simply saying we just start little, and a little bit, and we allow it to feel safer and safer, and your capacity will increase. Just like everything's a muscle, right? So even a muscle of relaxation is a muscle of relaxation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the other thing, I don't know if you've noticed this, but I remember when I first learned it with clients, I was a little bit blown away. So I wouldn't mind addressing it, because the window of tolerance is an interesting thing, but it's not always, I had an amazing window of tolerance for stress. Things were going on in my life, and my friends around me are like, Marina, how are you okay? How is this, like, are you okay? What do we need to do for you? You're so incredible. How are you handling disaster after disaster after disaster? And I was genuinely didn't feel stressed. I do have a massive capacity to deal with chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And yet what I've since learned is that there's like my capacity to receive support, not so good, right? And so it kind of, that's my own experience, but I've worked now with clients who their capacity to receive physical pleasure, not so big, so we think we have to, it's just, capacity is an interesting thing. And this, when you said before about, we have a window of tolerance, some of us have a very low window of tolerance for receiving love. Because
Absolutely.
we coded that as painful, or we have a really high capacity to handle anger and resentment and a really low capacity for compassion. So just as you're listening to Briana, if you're listening, remember, this isn't like you already have capacities that are vastly different in different realms of your life. And would you agree that the areas that we're not having the experience we want, that's where we get to go and look at where's our window of tolerance in that realm, and how can we stretch it to match the life that we want to live?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I so agree. And I so resonate with what you've said, that I was the same. I would live this life of chaos. I grew up traveling and, running my own business, and my life was like running at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and I would juggle it effortlessly. But much like you, I couldn't receive support. I couldn't receive love. I couldn't receive compliments. I couldn't receive money. I worked so hard, and yet I was still broke because money did not compute as safe within my system. And so, for me, money was my big thing that I had to learn, that it is safe to have money. And so I really had to work on, building that relationship that had me start to feel safe having large sums of money flow into my bank account. Even, at the time, it was even small amounts of money flowing into my bank account. So yeah, it's one of them things. We all have a different tolerance to different things based on our different experiences.
Yeah, no, I love it. And so with trauma, capital T trauma, as people in our field would describe it, or for those listening, I suppose trauma that you might associate from movies, or as you mentioned at the top of the podcast, I feel like there are beliefs out there, and I know you and I have sat down with people who will really feel like they'll never heal, and that they are broken because of what's happened to them. And so if anyone is listening to the podcast and thinking, yeah, I know technically you can fix things, but I'm okay, and I don't want to look at that anymore, and I got through it and it's behind me, because you can't really fix what's done, what would be your response to them? Like, do you believe that there is value for everyone in addressing trauma, and if so, why?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm mindful of how I word this, because I know that this can obviously be a very triggering topic for people. And I am such a deep believer that the depths determine the heights. So how far we go one way also determines how far we have the potential to go the other way. But going the other way is a choice. And so, I've worked with so many people who've experienced, sadly, the worst of the worst, unthinkable things. And it takes courage. There's no denying that. It takes insane levels of courage to really go there. And when we do that work, what's available to us is infinite. It's absolutely incredible. Some of the people that I've had the pleasure of working with, from these unspeakable acts that they've experienced to, they're now living these insane, incredible, dream lifestyles of purpose and service. And when we really look at it, that wouldn't have been possible if they didn't have this pain point that kept them kind of moving and kept them, I guess, being willing to dig into their own stories. So yeah, I really want to hit home. And again, I'm so mindful of how I say it, but our voids, the things that we feel are missing, pave way for our values. Our pain points pave way for our power.
Yeah, definitely. And yes, anything that we are resisting, one is stealing our life force, because think about the energy you're using to push that down. Number one, we forget about that. Number two, Yeah, I mean, much like you, it's the same, right? And you never dig into the essence of someone and find something that's not beautiful and remarkable. And you know, we have the benefit of knowing that, so we can encourage people into that. But I agree with you, it is a deeply courageous act, and part of it is because we're currently okay. You know, we might be not thriving, but because we're surviving, because we're safe, it's like, but what if it's worse? That's what I think that people think, but it never is. In my experience, any level of self-development, growth work, inner work, self-awareness, whatever you want to call it, it only leads to expansion. That's the point of it, is to unfold your map. It's to unfold you, right? So yes, I mean, if someone is listening and like, I just don't know, obviously you need to be ready, and obviously that may take time for you, but if you feel called, then you know, I feel, you know, trust the call, and you'll only find, you know, beautiful things if you, especially. But also what I will say is the growth work is not something you do with people in your circle who are perpetuating your struggles, or even your best friends. If you want to be held, if you have a capital T trauma, you need to see an expert. That's one thing I would say about that. And you need to do your due diligence around the level of expertise of that person too. That's you know, by the by. But the other question that I wanted to ask was, what do you think is the biggest misconception that high-performing women have around why, well, I mean, we're calling them high-performing women, but high-performing women generally want to be high-performing. Would you agree with that? Like, it's a bit of a constant double-edged sword. It's like, well, the world thinks I'm doing great, but I know I've got more potential. So what do you think is the biggest misconception that those women hold around what's holding them back?
Oh, that's a really good question. Honestly, I think a lot of the time, something that's very prevalent in all of my clients at the moment, and even in my own world, is often I think it's actually the smaller things. And you know, it's the subtleties, things like you know, where our day-to-day focus goes. I had a conversation with a client just earlier around, you know, she's just had this incredible opportunity open up, and she had some fears coming up. And I said, well, you know, tell me about these fears. And it came down to that there were just some people kind of in the background having a few things to say, and questioning whether or not she deserved this opportunity. And that was the thing that was having her doubt it. And I said to her, well, you know, how do you desire this to feel? Like, if you were to put all of that noise into the background and just shut off to it, what do you desire? And she told me, well, I want to take up the opportunity. And I said, well, then where do you want to put your focus?
Yeah.
Right. And so,
yeah, we're so often not self-sourced, you know, or not self, you know, directed, because we've lost a lot of faith in ourselves, haven't we? Do you feel like we just don't have a lot of self-trust? And when I say we, I mean collectively, because we're just told, I mean, everything about our system, you know, putting us in schools and telling us to sit down and listen, to be told by someone bigger and brighter than us what the way the world works. From day one, we're kind of screwed, because we're inscripted into that for 12 years or so. And then it continues on, and then there's hierarchy constantly. As a result, it's like, well, maybe they know better. Maybe they do know better. Like, who am I to know? But who else but you could know what's right for you, right? Like, it's just funny the way we get ourselves a little twisted in our thinking.
Exactly. So yeah, I think it's that piece of like, we let noise distract us and shift our focus and pull us off course and dysregulate us. And you know, I think really ultimately, to simplify all of it, it just comes down to a choice. What do you desire? How do you want this to feel? You know, what would the most grounded, centered, purposeful, self-connected, you know, version of you? Play the game. Yeah.
And then, you know, you work with high performance people. What do you think for someone who's like, well, shit, I'm not high performance, but I'd like to be? You know, someone's out there going, I'd like to be high performing. I'm definitely spinning my wheels over here. I'm definitely self-sabotaging like an Olympic athlete, as in not actually Olympic athlete, you know what I mean? A gold medalist sabotager. And I just can't get my shit together. Like, I just can't get my shit together. So what do you think, having worked with so many high performers across the field, what's the thing that maybe they've mastered or they innately had, or what's the distinction between someone who's spinning their wheels, not getting their shit together, and someone who is kicking goals and moving forward?
Well, first of all, I just want to say the number of women who are doing incredible things in the world and still don't identify with being a high performer, like, astounds me. I have the conversation almost daily. So I want to just preface that. But
do we need to look at ourselves, our self-identification? Then yeah, probably. Yeah. So
I think it just comes down to, again, that choice. I think it just comes down to, well, what do you want for yourself? And I think a lot of the time society has this pressure for us to always be more. And as you said, we're applauded for, the grind and the hustle and more, that's kind of the narrative, always searching for more. And some people really, if they get really connected with what they desire most, just want a really simple, easeful life. Some people do just genuinely want to, not do a whole bunch with their lives. And that's absolutely perfect. There's zero shame in that. It's when we start to, pile on society's narrative that, that's not enough, that we're lazy, that we're this, we're that. Mm-hmm. That's when we start to, I guess, get caught up in that. So yeah, I think it's getting really clear on, well, what do you actually choose for yourself? And so people who really do well for themselves and are those high performers, and when I say high performer, I'm umbrellaing that with the people who are really content.
Oh, yeah.
And just being,
that's the highest level of performance, happiness.
Yeah, totally.
I know a lot of people who have a lot of money and a lot of successful businesses. If you're miserable when you go home, if you do not like who you are, in my opinion, you're not performing at the highest level.
Yeah.
So yes, it's probably we should have clarified what is a high performer. Good point. But what I'm hearing you say, choices, like, that's our superpower, and people are using it often without the awareness of its impact in their lives daily. But what I'm hearing you say, that maybe the distinction between, category A and category B there is alignment. So if they've come into alignment and it activates them, then the alignment means their choices are aligned, and therefore there's more flow through, and that's why they're, quote unquote, maybe achieving more. I don't know, but achieving more, not so much necessarily in doing or hitting those goals as we're saying, but achieving what they want because they've come into alignment with their desires, as you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
So, for the person listening, the question really is, if your life just got wiped out, like through some cosmic, and you just got to rebuild it, right? Like, I always, every 6 months, I ask myself, if nothing stayed the same, what would I choose to create? Because often it's our attachment to what we've already invested in, or it's our attachment to the ideas that we have of what life could look like, should look like, and I luckily had a lot of quote unquote fairy tales just poof away in front of me, divorce, bankruptcy, all of those things. And so as a result, I have developed the capacity to just recreate and redesign, and to be okay with the shedding. But many of us are not, because we haven't yet been gifted that it's survivable, in our systems. And so a good question, if you're listening, is, if nothing stayed the same, how would you magic wand it to be? And then just look at those two pictures and ask, what could I do today that would move me a little closer or shift me a little closer, right? What other questions do you think are valuable, particularly around, we're talking today about trauma and high performance. So, the way I see that is, we're really talking about blocking us from our potential. If we get rid of the titles or the labels, we're talking about any human wanting to embody more of their potential or feel more of their capacity to feel any emotion, joy, bliss, happiness, whatever, pride, whatever you want to call it. And then there's a block. What kind of questions do you think have helped your clients dial in, and kind of unearth that?
Yeah. There's a beautiful question that an old mentor of mine once asked. So his name's Mitch B, and I don't want to take credit for this one. This one really changed the game for me. And his question was, and bear with me here, it's a little bit long-winded, but if you were to wake up tomorrow in the most crowded street in your city, and you had no clothes, no ID, no phone, no social media, nothing, you literally own nothing, completely clean slate, and you were tasked with building yourself back up to where you're at prior to having lost everything, what would you do? So to go and get clothes, to go and get identification, money, your phone, you know, to build connections, all of that, what would you do? And what the answer to that highlights to us, well, first of all, how resourceful we're willing to be. But in that, you know, I know for me, when I was first asked that, I was like, oh, well, shame comes up, you know, like, why am I in this position? What are people going to think? I'm naked on the street. My gosh, you know, the embarrassment of having to ask for help, the resistance to asking for help, you know, all of these stories and all of my edges came up in this thought process around how I'd build myself back up. And so I think it's such an incredibly powerful question to ask ourselves, because the answer to that question gives us clues to where we're blocking things in our own life currently. You know, so for me, again, it's that old wound. If we come back to the beginning, tripping up the gutter, the fear of being seen, you know, that there was that part of me when I was asked that question that was like, oh, I don't want to be seen naked in the streets. I don't want to be seen going and asking people for money or clothes or shelter or whatever. So it's, you know, they were my clues of like what I needed to stretch my edge on, what I needed to build more tolerance on.
Yeah. It's funny because as you said it, I was like, well, I just walk home and get my clothes. Like, cause I kind of maybe miss, cause I think, cause you said, cause you're in your city, the busiest street in your city. And I'm like, oh, well, have I just had a big night out? Like in my head, I was like, what's happened? I've had a really wild one. I've got no clothes on. So I best walk home. But even in the midst, maybe understanding of the concept of the question, notice that I was like, I'll just walk home. Like I'll walk my own legs home. And my pattern is, you know, taking care of my own shit, and, you know, being powerful, if you will. I didn't ask for a ride. I didn't think to even bother anyone with any requests. I was like, oh, well. But also, you know, if people want to perv, they can perv, I guess. You know, what time of day is it? Where are we? What are we doing? But it's a good question. I like scenarios like that, by the way. I like kind of, you know, just to see what pops up. And being in a it's funny, I actually have an amazing story. I won't share the prelude to it, but actually I will. I'll share it because it's a cool story, because what you described is essentially, I met someone on the street like that, but about 3 weeks before I met them, I had a clairaudience come through that just said, you need to help Mark, you need to save Mark. And I was like, I don't know a Mark, that's weird. But that night I was going to a party and I thought, oh, something's going to happen. I need to help someone there. And there wasn't. And so then of course I went into this self-doubt about, oh, you're just crazy. You think you can hear, you know, and I mean, I have incredible clairaudience, so it's stupid that I would even doubt it. But 3 weeks later, maybe not quite 3 weeks later, I had flown to New Orleans. I've never been in New Orleans. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. I was on a street corner where I was only on the street corner because we were jet lagged and, you know, you're out of your zone. And we were like, should we go eat, or should we paused on the street? Should we go eat here? Or should we go there? And this tall young man comes up and he's like dazed. And I could see he was physically distressed. He's like, can you help me? And I said, what's wrong? And he said, I don't even remember the last few hours. How's this? I've had all my cards stolen. I don't have my phone on me. I don't have any ID. Everything's gone. I don't know what to do. And I was like, oh, don't worry about the cards and money, mate. You can replace that. We'll just take you home. And he's like, I've only just arrived in New Orleans. I don't even know where I'm staying because my friends, we just got dropped to and then it just hit me. Oh, this guy really needs help. Like this is actually a situation that we need to help him with. And as I had that thought, he needs help, the person I was with said, what's your name? And he said, my name is Mark. And I was like, oh, and then I got so excited because I was like, Mark, I'm literally here to help you. And he's like, still really dazed and confused. He'd obviously, I think, been drugged and then had all this stuff stolen in New Orleans. We went through this big 4-hour tour. And anyway, we solved the puzzle and got him safely home. But that story reminded me of, oh, it sounds like Mark. He's lost all his stuff in the city. Anyway, that just took me totally off track, but
you're fine. I love that story.
It's a cool story. It really reminded me to have faith in myself and what I've developed. And so I did have a question I wanted to ask you, because I know this comes up a lot for clients that I work with, and I think people who are not yet being coached by someone it might be a very alive, let's say, concern, fear, or something that runs for them. And it's simply this, people often talk about being anxious or being stressed or, all these feelings, and they're feeling all the feelings and they're overwhelmed. And yet let's talk about numbness, because I don't think it gets talked about enough. And I know with the clients I work, that the number of people, and you said before, and I love that you said it, because I agree, the depths equal the heights. But when we don't feel anything, what do you, and so for someone listening, what I'm talking about is, if you were a person who's like, well, I'm never really happy, but I'm also never really sad, I'm not really ever any feeling. And they would be the kind of client that if I was to say, oh, what did you feel in that moment? It would take them maybe 10 minutes. And then they would describe a thought. I feel like they left me alone. That's not a feeling. It's that kind of thing. So when we're talking about trauma and when we're talking about nervous system, if someone has unintentionally, unconsciously, but very consciously at a certain time in their life, right, chosen to vacate the system, essentially, what would you say to someone who's like, yeah, that sounds like me, Bianca. I don't feel anything. I don't feel highs or lows, but I just don't feel anything. Numb.
Yeah. Well, I would say that numbness is a feeling.
Yes.
And so what I encourage them to tune into is that feeling of nothingness, that feeling of numbness, and to really tune into what numb feels like within your system. I think that, essentially numbness is disassociation. You worded it as it's vacating the system, and you nailed that. And I think that a lot of people are unknowingly, because they don't have a contrast to that experience, but are unknowingly heavily disassociated. They're not in their bodies. And this was definitely a learning curve for me. I had to relearn how to be really present in my body, particularly my gut. I've realized over the previous, couple of years how much I disassociate from my midsection, from my gut. And so I would spend, it sounds so crazy, but I would lay there at night and just really tune into the feeling of not being able to feel my stomach, and slowly over time, I started to go, I felt something, like there's something other than nothing. And so, just that in and of itself, really tuning into the feeling of numbness and the feeling of nothingness actually starts to reconnect you to, sensation.
Beneath that numbness, there will be feeling, but we have to sit with it long enough, don't we?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And not lament that there's no feeling, like it's because, just to clarify for anyone listening, it might sound there like you're saying focus on the no feeling, which of course would expand the no feeling, in the same way that you were saying earlier about energy. And yet really what I'm hearing you say, maybe with different language, is be with the no feeling.
Yes.
When you bring your presence to the thing that is a no thing, then it will soften. Like it's like anything, like if we be fully present with a child, or fully present even with an animal in nature, that they will soften. And so, I would agree with you. I was just curious as to, it's just something that I think doesn't get voiced enough. And I think there are people out there experiencing numbness and feeling broken as a result. And it is a safety mechanism, right? Like that. Yeah. And so, for yourself, what it, like, as a quick tip, if we were to do some rapid fire, what would be the number one tip that you recommend to people or to yourself to activate energy?
The number one tip to activate energy for me, my go-to is dance. I think that dance is just I love movement, love movement. So you can feel through, even numbness, to come back to that freeze response, the numbness, you can feel through numbness through dance. You can feel through and move through fight, flight, all of it through dance. And I think that there's no limit to what you can sort of shift and activate and move through dance.
To be honest, I love dance too, and I have no problems dancing. Much to the, the frustration perhaps of some people who go out with me at times, but there are lots of people who refuse to dance, like who really, like, it seems to be an area of social activities that has a real block for a lot of people,
Yeah.
because maybe like you tripping up the gutter, they did a dance move at the high school. I don't know, but there is something that they think they can't do it right. They can't, I don't know. So, I mean, would you say any movement if they're not dancing, or?
Well, I think there's an interesting thing here with dance, because often it's not that they can't dance. I mean, everyone can dance.
They can't dance. They can dance.
Yeah, it's the judgment of there's a way that it's supposed to look,
Yeah,
and I don't fit into that, therefore I can't dance.
Yeah,
and
even
so
bad dancers can dance badly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm joking. I'm not saying we're a bad dancer, but my point is we can all dance. I agree with you. Sorry.
Yeah, so it's more so about practicing not judging ourselves in that
Mhm.
moment, and that might look like go lock yourself in your room for 5 minutes and put on a song and just be okay with feeling really dorky.
Yeah, though, I mean, because these are exercise, I do a lot of embodiment programs, and I mean, I give them probably, well, definitely way tougher, let's say societally judged exercises to embody. And yet the thing that you're suggesting, simply, I mean, if you're listening and you're someone who's like, I would never dance, do exactly what we're talking about, and put yourself in a room where there are no eyeballs, and play some music and dance, and notice all the fucking voices, excuse my language, that you hear, that are the judgment voices that are there even when no one's there. And so it can really highlight to you your own resistance to letting go and being fluid in your movement and looking a fool. It's so in you. When I say in you, it's not of you, it's in you, because you picked it up along the way and you've been carrying it. But I always think, well, if everyone at a dance floor is worried about how they look, no one is worried about me at all. So I can just let loose. It's just another way to think about that. Yes. So sorry, dance for energy. I love that. What about for empowerment? What's your quick go-to if you want to feel more empowered?
For me, it's journaling on what I want. Like, what's the vision? When I get really, I'm a big picture thinker. So when I get juiced up in kind of envisioning what I want to create, then I'm like, ooh, okay, cool. And then it becomes this thing of well, how do I create that? Who do I need to be?
Yes, I am actually very much the same. Sitting down and drafting a dream. I mean, I have a program called Dream Builder. It's my favorite thing. It's what do I want?
Yeah.
And yet, and I'm sure there are people listening, for some people that would just drop them into overwhelm, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's, I'm with you. I love it. And, people need to find what works for them. And so what do you do? And I'm curious about this, given that you shared that one of your earlier traumas, had you believe that it's not safe to be seen. So the question is, what do you do to elevate your experience of expression? So putting your message in the world, or even in your family, in your circle, in your community, online, how do you activate expression?
For me, it's always doing the thing that I least want to do. So, because my biggest wound is the wound of being seen. And the thing that I desire the most is to be seen. Right. And I think that's true from most people in some way, shape, or form. And so, I notice the places I don't want to go. I notice the things I don't want to do. And then I play in that, and I make it a game, right? Because when it's play, it's safe. We're safe. We're signaling to their system that we're safe. We're not under threat. So, I'll play little games. I had the awareness pop up a couple of years ago when I just got back into the dating realm, that I had this thing where I could hold eye contact with anyone except someone that I found attractive. So I set myself this little dare of okay, well, every time I see someone attractive, I'm going to hold eye contact with them for at least 3 seconds longer than felt comfortable.
Oh, you're going to look like a creepo. Yeah, I love that. You're literally going to have those people be like, wow, what is up with this chick? Yeah, I love that. I had a similar, I am much the same. I have a very strong, what I call gypsy energy. So games and fun allow me access to things. And I used to have a rule that if I ever said I could never, then I immediately had to. So it's kind of similar, but then I got really smart and I stopped saying I will never ever. But honestly, saying I could never taught me how to fast, because I used to say I could never not eat for a day. And then the next day I fasted for the first day ever and nearly died because I didn't know anything about the science of fasting. But, since went on and learned a lot more about it. But I think that's a great practice. But the other thing I'll say about that is you and I are orientated towards growth. So there's a part of us that pulls towards the edge. And I don't know if you had noticed this, but not everyone's wired like that, not intuitively or innately, and that's okay. But what would you suggest to people who are like, well, I'm definitely not going to go do the thing I feel uncomfortable about because I feel uncomfortable about it. Like if they're just like, that logic doesn't play, and they can understand the logic, but if they're like, I'm not going to, do you think making it playful is the solution there? Or are there any other tips for someone who's like, I know I should do the thing, but I'm just going to procrastinate my ass off instead?
Honestly, my response to that would be just be okay with that. It's not important to you. If growth isn't something that is deeply valuable to you, then why seek growth? If you're someone who is so happy, just being where you are, perfect.
Well, I really like what you said, because actually it's kind of a little tongue in cheek, right? Because if they're like, oh, I know I really want to do this thing, but I'm not prepared to do it. I love that approach that you just took, which is like, well, just be really okay that it's not a priority, is maybe a better way of saying you don't want to grow. Because when I remember I had a doctor that told I had the worst gut health. Anyway, it's a whole other story. And, he was telling me what I needed to do nutritionally to change it. And I didn't want to make those changes because they were really hard. And I really like food. I'm like a foodie. And it was like giving up all the things I like. And I was like trying to weasel, like, well, what if I just this? And what if I just that? And then he just straight up, this is a doctor, said, Marina, I don't give a fuck if you eat this way or not. It's your life. And I've told you what's going to help. So you choose. I tell you, it landed like a fucking ton of bricks. I was like, oh, he's not going to play this game with me. He doesn't get affected by it. It really is my life and my choice. And so, if someone's like, well, I'm just going to procrastinate, fine. Well, then be okay that you won't ever have the change, and be okay that it's not a priority, but stop lying to yourself that it is if you're not willing to step up. I kind of like that energy. When you said it, I was like, yeah, she told you.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's the honesty piece. I try so hard to be really honest with myself about where I'm at, because we can sit there and bullshit and say I want this, but I don't want to do any of the things to actually get there. Then you don't want it.
Well, that's it. If you're willing to sit in your own bullshit, you're going to have a pretty shitty life. Let that land, right? If you're sitting in your own bullshit 24/7, you're going to have a shitty life. You have to call yourself on your bullshit. Or get a coach. The thing is, a coach can call you on bullshit, but if you're not going to step up, it's still not going to change. It always comes down to you at the end of the day.
Absolutely. And there's absolutely no shame in not wanting to move.
Yeah.
Again, it's that piece of when we start adding all the stories of why I shouldn't be this way, that's when it becomes difficult. But if you're really honest with yourself about where you're at, then and you just learn to accept that and love that about yourself, then you're already there. You're already exactly where you want to be.
You are always exactly where you want to be. And the feeling is always available. But the one thing I want to maybe just tag on to that is, we're not saying suck it up, buttercup. We are simply saying, if we round out the whole conversation in context, is if you really do desire it, if it truly is aligned for you and you feel stuck, there will be a block, and the block can be resolved and dissolved if you're willing to dive in. And that's certainly been my experience. There's nothing that you can't have if you truly want it, but it's not so much that you have to push hard against that rigid edge. Instead, step back, accept that it's there, and then allow it to teach you the lesson that it's already learned, that it's persistent in repeating. And in doing that, it's like, oh, it just unfolds. Change doesn't have to be hard, but you do have to be courageous. I would agree with that you said earlier. It really is more a courage piece.
Yes, absolutely.
And so, are there any books that you think just changed the game for you, that you were like, that was pivotal? Or my favorite book ever in the PD space is?
Conversations with God.
Always.
Yep, love that book. And The Breakthrough Experience by Dr. John Demartini.
I heard actually in a fair bit of your language. I was like, oh, John Demartini again.
Yeah, love his work. It's very cognitive.
Yes.
But
very well thought out processes. I often reference his frameworks. Yeah, no, brilliant. We'll link to both of those in the show notes. And then what is it for you personally right now that you are working through or working on that you might like to share, so we can, one, see that it's a game that everyone plays, and two, we can hold the intention of that for you as a collective in the field?
Yeah, as in some of my processes that I'm moving through.
What you're currently like stretching into, intending on working with. Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. I love this question. So I'm actually in the process of relaunching my podcast. And so it's really quite beautiful to witness some of the stories come up for me. Again, the being seen piece. You know, I last had my podcast 2 years ago, and I haven't recorded an episode since. And my audience has grown a lot since then. So noticing those stories come up of, you know, oh, more eyes on me and all of that. So it's been a really beautiful experience for me in stepping into that.
Okay. Well, we will link to everything that you do so that when it's launched, we can tune in, because that sounds, I know it'll be amazing. Yeah. And as always, thank you for the work that you do in the world, and you know, the healing that you offer people, and the capacity for them to step into their potential, because that ripple is real. As every person, you know, rises into their potential, it really is a permission slip for others to do the same. And I think that's what it's all about. So yeah, I see you, and and I love the work that you do, Brianna. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.